After saying good night to his sister, Monsieur Bienvenu took one of the silver candlesticks from the table, handed the other to his guest, and said, Monsieur, let me show you to your room. The man followed him. As must be clear from what has been said, the house was so arranged that one could reach the alcove in the oratory only by going through the bishop's bedroom. Just as they were going through his room, Madame Magloire was putting the silver away in the cupboard at the head of the bed, the last thing she did every night before going to sleep. The bishop left his guest in the alcove in front of a clean white bed. The man placed the candlestick on a small table. Now, said the bishop, a good night's sleep to you. Tomorrow morning, before you go, you'll drink a cup of warm milk from our cows. Thank you, Monsieur l'Abbé, said the man. Scarcely had he pronounced those words of peace than suddenly he made a strange gesture that would have horrified the two women of the house if they had witnessed it. Even now it is hard for us to understand what impulse he obeyed at that moment. Did he intend to give a warning or a threat, or was he simply obeying a sort of instinctive impulse, obscure even to himself? He turned abruptly toward the old man, crossed his arms, and glaring at his host, exclaimed harshly, So now, you let me stay in your house, as near to you as that? He checked himself and added with a laugh that had a trace of something horrible, Have you thought I might be a murderer? The bishop replied, God will take care of that. Then, gravely moving his lips like one praying or talking to himself, he raised two fingers of his right hand and blessed the man, who, however, did not bow, and without turning his head or looking behind him, went toward his room. When the alcove was in use, a heavy serge curtain was drawn in the oratory, concealing the altar. But this curtain the bishop knelt as he passed and offered a short prayer. A moment later he was walking in the garden, surrendering mind and soul to a dreamy contemplation of these grand and mysterious works that God shows at night to eyes still open. As to the man, he was so completely exhausted that he did not even avail himself of the clean white sheets. He blew out the candle with his nostril as convicts do, collapsed into the bed fully dressed, and into a sound sleep. Midnight struck as the bishop came back to his room. A few minutes later the little house was all asleep. Toward the middle of the night, Jean Valjean awoke. Jean Valjean was born into a poor peasant family in the Brie region. In his childhood he had not been taught to read. When he had come of age, he chose the occupation of a pruner at Faverolles. His mother's name was Jean Mathieu. His father's Jean Valjean or Valjean, probably a nickname of contraction of Voilà Jean. Jean Valjean was thought, though not sad, a characteristic of affectionate natures. On the whole, however, there was something immature and passive to all appearances, at least in Jean Valjean. He had lost his parents when he was very young. His mother died of a poorly treated milk fever. His father, a pruner before him, was killed when he fell from a tree. Jean Valjean now had only one relative left, his older sister, a widow with 7 children, girls and boys. This sister had brought up Jean Valjean, and as long as her husband lived, she had taken care of her younger brother. Her husband died, leaving the eldest of these children at 8, the youngest 1 year old. Jean Valjean was just 25. Taking the father's place, he supported the sister who had reared him. He did it naturally as a duty, but with a trace of surliness. His youth was spent in rough and poorly paid labor. He was never known to have a sweetheart. He had no time to be in love. At night he came in weary and ate his soup without a word. While he was eating, his sister, Mother Jeanne, frequently took out of his bowl the best of his meal, a bit of meat, a slice of bacon, the heart of the cabbage, to give to one of her children. Eating steadily, his head down nearly in the soup, his long hair falling over his dish, hiding his eyes, he did not seem to notice and let it happen. At Faverolles, not far from the Valjeans' house on the other side of the road, there was a farmer's wife named Marie Claude. The Valjean children, always famished, sometimes went in their mother's name to borrow a pint of milk, which they would drink behind a hedge or in some nook of the lane, snatching away the pitcher so greedily one from another that the little girls would spill it on their aprons and throats. If their mother had known, she would have punished the delinquent severely. Jean Valjean, rough and grumbler as he was, paid Marie Claude their mother never knew, and so the children escaped punishment. In the pruning season, he earned 18 sous a day. After that, he hired out as a reaper, workman, teamster, or laborer. He did whatever he could find to do. His sister worked also, but what could she do with 7 little children? It was a sad group, gradually held tighter and tighter in the grip of misery. One very severe winter, Jean had no work. The family had no bread. Literally, no bread, and 7 children. One Sunday night, Maubert Isabeau, the baker on the Place des l'Église in Faverolles, was just going to bed when he heard a crash against the barred window of his shop. He got down in time to see an arm thrust through the opening made by the blow of a fist against glass. The arm seized one loaf of bread and took it. Isabeau rushed out. The thief was making off at top speed. Isabeau pursued and caught him. The thief had thrown away the bread, but the arm was still bleeding. It was Jean Valjean. So now we know why he got thrown in jail. He got thrown in jail for stealing a loaf of bread for his nieces and nephews. This happened in 1795. Jean Valjean was brought before the tribunals of the time for burglary at night in an inhabited house. He had a gun which he used as well as any marksman in the world and was something of a poacher, which worked against him, there being a natural prejudice against poachers. The poacher, like the smuggler, is nearly a brigand, but we must note in passing that there is still a deep gulf between that sort of man and the horrible assassin of the city. The poacher lives in the forest, and the smuggler in the mountain or on the sea. Cities produce ferocious men because they produce corrupt men. Mountains, the forest, and the sea make men savage. They develop fierceness, but usually without destroying the human. Jean Valjean was found guilty. The terms of the penal code were explicit. In our civilization, there are fearful times when the criminal law wrecks a man. How mournful the moment when society draws back and permits the irreparable loss of a sentient being. Jean Valjean was sentenced to 5 years in prison. In Paris, on April 22nd, 1796, came the announcement of the victory of the Montagnat, achieved by the commanding general of the army of Italy. Okay, so we don't need the rest of this chapter. The rest of this chapter is just basically going in how Jean Valjean had after he had been put in jail, the 5 years for stealing, he then tried to escape. And so that added to his time. So each time he got close to the time, he tried to escape, which added to his time. So the next time when we pick up, because the next chapter is also not important. So all we need, we're going to pick up at chapter 8, which is Deep Waters, Dark Shadows. So this is when he is still in jail, and one of the ways that he escaped.